When Hezbollah launched its first rockets toward Israel, it triggered a war that amounted to the defense of Iran and horror for the Lebanese. From that day on, Lebanon would see attacks and bombs on its territory, while the Israelis would experience what their enemies had in store as new tactics for that year's fighting. The Lebanese man was followed as he tried to hide among the trees after the rockets were launched at the Israelis. It was useless. From among the clouds, the targeting system locked onto him, launching a guided missile that detonated over the man's body. His companions were tracked the same way. Another munition circled overhead until it brought the Hezbollah fighters' course to an end. The advantage of monitoring and waiting was to check the route of each one. This way, the Israelis discovered the bases and made them collapse. Many of them fell, turning into rubble in a matter of seconds. Low-ranking soldiers and leaders turned into prayers and cries of lament for Lebanon, while the Israeli troops marched north. The Middle East was at war again. To no one's surprise, Israel and Hezbollah entered into a conflict that shook Lebanon, triggering a ground invasion that would shake negotiations and allies. Proving what happens when a population is subjected to greater external powers within its own state. It wasn't the first war between Israel and Lebanon. Beirut very early on became a transit route in the fight against Israel. In 1903, Arab networks connected to the war against Israel recruited or facilitated the arrival of European veterans, including former members of the Wehrmacht, Bosniaks, Albanians, and Croats. With a history of collaboration with the Axis, some of them landed in Beirut and went on to Damascus to join the Arab Liberation Army. The years of war followed when the Palestine Liberation Organization settled in Lebanon, leading to the war from 1968 to 1982. In 1978, Israel invaded southern Lebanon to push the PLO away from the border. After that, the UN presence was established and expanded through UNIFIL. From 1982 onwards, the war would be against Syrian and Lebanese forces, which led to the formation of Hezbollah. The Israelis occupied southern Lebanon until the year 2000, when they then withdrew. By that time, Hezbollah was already a force within the country, a separate political movement. The Shiite organization was already supported by Iranian forces, receiving financial and logistical support, as well as training from the IRGC. The Revolutionary Guard Corps, the elite of Iran's armed forces, which acted as a parallel and ideological force dedicated to protecting and safeguarding the regime. In 2006, Hezbollah crossed the Israeli border, killed 8 Israeli soldiers, and captured 2, creating a pretext for Israel and starting a war that lasted 34 days until August 14, 2006. When Hamas carried out its terrorist attack on October 7, 2023, killing hundreds of people, the Palestinian organization expected a bigger reaction from Hezbollah. The war in Gaza escalated. Israel responded to the terrorism and crimes committed by Hamas with its own crimes. Thousands of civilians died or were left homeless. All the Lebanese organization did was open a war of attrition on Israel's northern front. The conflict escalated in 2024 with heavy Israeli airstrikes and an Israeli ground invasion in southern Lebanon in October 2024. Hezbollah's leadership was virtually wiped out during this period. It was not easy for the Lebanese to endure this. The airstrikes were devastating. There was a fragile peace with localized attacks afterward. Then, Israel and the United States attacked Iran. The conflict began on February 28, 2026. At that moment, Hezbollah had to make a choice: either bring Lebanon into the war or simply remain passive. But, proving that it was actually more of an Iranian armed force inside Lebanon than a Lebanese organization, they chose to bring the country into the war, exposing its population to a greater threat. So Hezbollah's men, in the name of the Iranian regime, fired their first salvo of rockets on March 2, 2026. The night was disturbed by the sound of Hezbollah's rockets flying toward Israel. The barrage of more than 2,000 rockets and drones was launched at northern Israel. Among the targets was the Mishmar HaKarmel anti-missile defense base near Haifa. Of course, civilian structures were hit, as was common in Hezbollah's attacks. The Israelis were ready for this. It was quite likely that they were even hoping the enemies would take that action, giving them reasons to expand into southern Lebanon, a plan already in Benjamin Netanyahu's mind. Drones from Tel Aviv flew over Lebanon. Hezbollah's gunfire trying to contain the attack echoed through the night, giving a final warning to anyone who hadn't realized that Lebanon was at war. Immediately, hundreds of people began to leave the region, anticipating what would come next, a fear shared by every citizen in Lebanon as soon as the war in Iran began. Bombs were already falling on Beirut and other cities during the early morning hours, the worst possible wake-up call. Most people had nowhere to hide, unlike Hezbollah, with its extensive network of tunnels and bunkers. The precision-guided bombs dropped by airplanes fell on the main locations where Hezbollah maintained command posts or launched its rockets. The idea was the rare, swift decapitation of the militia's command structure as happened in 2024. On March 2nd, Israeli operations managed to eliminate Hussein Makhled, the head of Hezbollah's intelligence services, in an attack that, according to the Lebanese Ministry of Health, killed at least 52 people and injured another 154. Adnan al-Othman, commander of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, was one of the first to fall back on March 3rd. It was well known that Hamas commanders were taking refuge in Lebanon, and among them, Wazim Atala Ali was directly targeted by Israeli attacks in the Badal Palestinian camp. Another target was Ibrahim Ghazali, connected to Hezbollah's anti-tank unit and brother of a terrorist who attacked one of the synagogues in the United States. He was with his family when the bomb hit his house, killing his family members as well, including children. In the following days, the civilian toll from these bombings began to emerge. The horror was just beginning in Lebanon. The Israeli fury was spreading across the country. In Beirut, civilians were caught in the crossfire. In a hotel room, operatives from the Iranian Special Forces, the Quds Force, were gathered when they were caught by surprise by the explosion. On March 11, the Israelis discovered the whereabouts of Ali Busalam Tabaja, the IRGC's liaison commander with Hezbollah. The Iranian was hit by a bomb himself and was obliterated in the attack. The hunt continued. The intensity of the attacks in March devastated buildings and homes throughout Lebanon. A headquarters belonging to the pro-Iran militia Imam Hossein division in southern Lebanon was also attacked. The group's commander died during the explosion. So much destruction did not happen without civilians being massacred. By March 15, Lebanon had already recorded about 850 dead and more than 2,100 injured, including Hezbollah fighters and civilians. On March 13, a health clinic in Burj Khalifa was obliterated, resulting in the death of 12 medical professionals. Of course, Hezbollah's insistence on keeping attack equipment and command centers in civilian areas contributed to these deaths. But that did not in any way exempt Israel from the crimes committed, not at all. And it could still get worse, as was proven during the ground campaign. Israeli tanks had already made their presence felt in Lebanon at the beginning of the war. Proof of this was when they fired at the Ghanaian battalion headquarters of the UN peacekeeping force in Al-Qawza. Blue helmets were injured, which resulted in a rare apology from Tel Aviv. 10 days later, on March 16, the tanks were already crossing the so-called Blue Line. The Blue Line was the withdrawal line drawn by the UN in 2000 to confirm whether Israel had left southern Lebanon after the occupation that had been maintained since the 1980s. The goal of the new invasion was to create a buffer zone or advanced defense zone in southern Lebanon, pushing Hezbollah north of the Litani River and destroying Hezbollah's tunnels, depots, launchers, and infrastructure. Explosions were already constant when the Israeli defense minister declared the intention to demolish Lebanese border villages and maintain a permanent occupation south of the Litani. Israel established the so-called Yellow Line, a de facto military border inside Lebanese territory. It extended up to about 10 kilometers into Lebanon and covered an occupation zone estimated between 570 and 608 square kilometers. Beyond that strip, Israeli drones specifically targeted the leadership of Hezbollah. One of them was Raj and Yusuf Ismail Hashem, a key figure in Hezbollah for more than 40 years, overseeing its restructuring and commanding the launching of rockets and drones against Israel. Zaid Ali Jama, Hezbollah's head of firepower management, was another one located in Beirut and killed by Israeli fire in a matter of seconds. Obviously, Hezbollah did not remain passive after having started this conflict. The battle in Qiyam was one of the key moments since the beginning of this war. That was a high strategic position for both the Israelis and Hezbollah. The Lebanese militia began staging ambushes using guided missiles and kamikaze drones. Hezbollah learned from Hamas's mistakes in Gaza. They knew how to deal with the famous Merkava tanks. In one of these ambushes, 3 tanks were destroyed in 15 minutes, with one of them being hit when it was used to rescue the wounded from the first 2. One of the first pillars of these attacks was the integration of the Mi-STOL and the optimization of core EM tactics. The Mi-STOL mass-produced in Iran was the result of sophisticated reverse engineering carried out on Israeli missiles. Spike, captured by Hezbollah in the 2006 war, the Mi-STOL followed a parabolic trajectory, rising vertically before diving onto the target. This vertical trajectory nullified the effectiveness of the TROF active protection system of the Israeli Merkava tanks, whose radars had blind spots at the upper zenith, ensuring the penetration of the thinner armor on the tank's roof by means of aerobatic tandem warheads. This wasn't the only surprise Hezbollah had for the Israelis. Tanks, armored vehicles, and soldiers would be hunted in the battles that followed. The fighting in Qiyam was tough. The Israelis were learning that Hezbollah was prepared for their tanks and still didn't have a full answer for that. The Israeli tactics remained the same. Bombs crossed the skies to find Lebanese militia targets and blow them up. The Israelis had several weapons available to pulverize their enemies. Among them was the GBU-39, a small diameter guided bomb that glided through the Lebanese skies, guided by GPS, until it exploded over a target. When necessary, heavier explosives weighing almost a ton were used. They used JDAM kits for GPS guidance. This inertial system, called INS, helped the bomb stay guided even with partial interference. The number of Hezbollah casualties increased every day. March was already over and April 2026 was beginning while the Israeli attacks continued. The war in Iran had reached a stalemate, but in Lebanon the battle was fierce. Hezbollah continued firing its drones and rockets at Israeli territory. Civilians were hit in the cities when the Iron Dome failed to intercept them. The Israelis pursued the locations where the Lebanese militia agents were hiding. The men were identified by drones and followed to their bases. There they were struck by bombs. The detonations were precise. Those who survived had to run before being eliminated by a new attack. Drones were an essential weapon in the war. There was no turning back from that technology. The Israelis used the Hermes 450 or Hermes 900 to monitor and track Hezbollah soldiers throughout the entire process of transporting weapons or firing rockets. Many of the locations where the weapons were used were clearly residential. When blown up by the Israelis, this equipment would launch its rockets uncontrollably in dangerous secondary detonations. Guided bombs with an Amicalite had less than 2 kilograms of HV-10 explosive composition, but that was enough to put those systems out of action. The smaller missiles in the Spike family had a heavier payload, reaching up to 10 kilograms of explosives. They pursued their targets up to 10 kilometers and could be automatic or have their trajectory adjusted during flight. The hunt for Hezbollah was intense. The operatives of the militia, funded by Iran, were incinerated by explosions every time they were identified carrying their weapons and trying to hide from the fury coming from the south, whether by land or by air. The Israelis relied too much on their drones and forgot that Hezbollah also learned something about that. And that was a fatal mistake for the troops under Tel Aviv's command. Israeli intelligence knew that their enemies were rearming, but they didn't realize some of the risks. For decades, Syria was the main logistical route for sending advanced weapons from Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon. With Assad's fall and the interruption of that route, the group became more isolated and had to reduce its dependence on imported heavy missiles. As it adapted, it began to invest more in local drone production and in modernizing munitions using underground workshops, 3D printing, and commercial electronic components. One of these locally produced drones was the Ababil Avabilte, a small predator that hunted much larger prey, such as Merkava tanks or armored personnel carriers. The tanks came under the new threat's dive attacks. There was no preparation or prior plans for these FPV drones. Hezbollah was one step ahead of the Israeli Defense Forces, devouring the metal rolling along Lebanon's roads. Unlike drones guided by radio or GPS, the new weapons did not maintain a physical connection with the operator through a fiber-optic ultralight cable, which made it difficult for Israel to jam them with electronic warfare and could extend for kilometers. Small, cheap, and flying low, these drones used the terrain of southern Lebanon to approach armored vehicles without appearing as a traditional threat. Some were armed with anti-armor charges, becoming a cheap alternative to anti-tank missiles and a serious problem for armored vehicles. And that wasn't all. It was clear proof of Israel's lack of preparation. The Israeli issue was in the way the soldiers were moving. At several moments, Israeli soldiers gathered in a way that would be almost unthinkable in a war marked by drones like the one in Ukraine. These gatherings ended up turning entire groups into vulnerable targets for kamikaze drones, which dove onto them and caused deaths or serious injuries. In one of the most impressive episodes, Israeli soldiers gathered to evacuate a wounded person and were waiting for the arrival of a helicopter. The concentration of these men at the same spot created exactly the kind of target that an FPV drone was looking for. The drone appeared, but one of the soldiers noticed the threat in time. The scene turned into chaos. Men ran, stumbled, sought cover, and opened fire. They barely managed to destroy the drone, or the threat fell due to the wind produced by the helicopter before it hit the group and caused a bigger tragedy. The Israelis slowly began to learn from this, first by copying the attack weapons. Of course, the heavy Israeli drones continued to operate in Lebanon at all times. Their cameras tracked the Hezbollah fighters until the weapons locked onto the target and flew in for the final detonation against the enemy. Meanwhile, the soldiers fought on the ground, firing at Hezbollah forces. Some of them even found themselves cornered by the Lebanese militia. Grenades and rifles were only enough to keep them alive, but it was the drones and airstrikes that solved the problem. The explosions gradually brought down the resistance funded by Iran. During this time, Israel's smaller FPV drones went into action. These weapons began to surround the Hezbollah fighters, gradually transforming the war in Lebanon. There was no time to rest. Now the terror was captured on the soldiers' faces. It wasn't just a distant aerial broadcast. The fear was etched in their eyes before the flames took the enemy's life. It was hard to escape. Heavy drones hovered in the sky and the small FPVs flew swiftly even after the dead surrounding the Hezbollah fighters. A small explosion threw broken men onto the asphalt. Some of these wounded soldiers dressed as Syrians threw away their weapons to avoid further risks. The Israeli victory at Qiyam gave the Israeli forces the momentum to continue their advance northward. The next step was the Beirut Blitz, which was reached in early April. On April 9, 2026, the 98th Israeli Paratrooper Division, supported by the 1st Golani-Polani Brigade and the 35th Paraguayan Paratrooper Brigade, began the ground assault on the city in what was called Operation Silver Plow. Hezbollah defended the metropolitan area with intense sniper fire, improvised explosive devices in narrow alleys, and direct hand-to-hand combat in the city market. Unable to advance quickly without heavy losses, the Israeli Defense Forces began to systematically destroy the urban area of the Beirut Blitz. The city was almost wiped out. Satellite images indicated that about 90% of the urban grid was destroyed or damaged, including more than 3,000 homes and the Great Ottoman Mosque, which was over 400 years old. On May 12, the Israeli Defense Forces had consolidated absolute military control, standing over the ruins of the Beirut Blitz. Even though Hezbollah was the enemy to be destroyed, the devastation caused by Israel was a crime against Lebanese civilians. But there would be a day worse than this. The war between Iran and the United States was at a stalemate. Negotiations were poor in April 2026, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the Americans were unable to deal with the problems in the Strait of Hormuz and lacked the political will for a larger war inside Iran. A ceasefire was attempted, but by that time Iran was already in a comfortable position, sustaining wars in other countries and keeping its own territory free from these problems. Their remaining challenges were concentrated in the Strait of Hormuz, with the cities no longer experiencing the bombings from the beginning of the war. Unlike its financier, Hezbollah was still suffering attacks in Lebanon, and civilians experienced the height of this horror on what became known as Black Wednesday, when Israeli fire swept through the country. Summarily rejecting the premise that the American and Iranian truce would include its war with Hezbollah in Lebanon, Tel Aviv launched Operation Eternal Darkness. 50 fighter jets tore across Lebanese skies. In about 10 minutes, they dropped 160 munitions on densely populated areas in central and coastal Beirut, in the city of Tyre, in the eastern Bekaa Valley, and in Sidon. At least 200 Hezbollah militants were consumed by the attack, evaporated under the aerial onslaught. Something depicted by the list of lamentations published by the militia. Among them was Ali Yusuf Hashim, the personal secretary and nephew of the leader Naim Qassem. The collateral and human damage, however, took on the contours of mass atrocity. Hospitals in Beirut were absolutely overwhelmed, with a total of more than 357 dead and 1,223 wounded recorded in a single day. The operation plunged peace efforts into limbo amid distrust and exacerbated Israel's diplomatic isolation. After that, the Battle of Blint Beit Jabil progressed until the Israeli forces finally reached the Litani River. The crossing was difficult, but Tel Aviv's forces prevailed, occupying the northwest bank and cutting off part of Hezbollah's supply lines. The situation continued, with Hezbollah resisting the Israeli advances. Drones and rockets prevented the tanks from advancing. Stalled by the Lebanese effort, the Israelis retreated to Hashaf. In the direction of Zawar al-Shakya, Hezbollah abandoned Bufor Castle, built during the Crusades on high ground. It seemed like an easy victory. However, the drones were active, searching for victims among the officers from Tel Aviv. An easy target was found in Israel's continued unpreparedness for that threat. The FPV drones targeted the Givat Brigade leadership, injuring battalion commanders and killing the medical officer Ori Yosef Sylvester. He was not the only one among the higher-ranking Israeli casualties. Colonel Meir Biederman, commander of the 441st Brigade, had boasted about having anti-drone surprises before entering Lebanon, but ended up seriously wounded on May 20th near Debel. As June approached, the surprises became increasingly bitter for Hezbollah, proving that they were just a tool for Iran. The war continued in June, with the Israelis controlling a large part of the territory in southern Lebanon and Hezbollah maintaining its attacks through ambushes. The Israeli rear was under constant threat from drones. In addition, rockets continued to fly against Israel, many of them hitting important civilian areas. The areas far from the front line were not safe for the Lebanese militia either. Their men were blown up inside cars, and air support eliminated more terrorists at their bases in several cities. The Israelis' intelligence network was powerful in Lebanon. This factor, combined with drones monitoring every movement kilometers from the front line, allowed them to hunt down enemy fighters anywhere. Among the Israeli victories was the capture of one of Hezbollah's prized assets, an underground infrastructure in Majd al-Zoum. The complex was said to be over 200 meters long, between 20 and 25 meters deep, with 12 sections, tons of explosives, and dozens of large Iranian drones. And there was an important detail. The site was less than 20 meters from a mosque, precisely to make airstrikes more difficult and to protect the military infrastructure under civilian cover. The hunt for the Hezbollah leadership continued. This time, they were searching for Ali Musa Daktuk. Airstrikes blew up bases across Lebanon, trying to find powerful Hezbollah figures. Daktuk had been important within the militia's special forces for years. He acted as the architect who structured the pro-Iranian Shia militias in Iraq after the United States invasion in 2003. While houses and bases were being blown up and his soldiers hunted down, Daktuk tried to move around and stay away from the fire until he was found on June 12 and turned to dust, just like the others. Although Daktuk fell days later, Hezbollah plotted its revenge. The target was Lieutenant Colonel Dor Gedalia Ben Simon, the 32-year-old commander of the 52nd Battalion of the 401st Armored Brigade. He was overseeing the advance of the troops when Hezbollah launched its drones against the Israelis. Lieutenant Colonel's Merkava was pulverized, resulting in the instant death of the high-ranking officer and the other 3 crew members. Israeli fire continued to rain down on Lebanon even after this loss. Many of these strikes hit civilians, as bombs exploded buildings during the day while cars were still driving through the city streets. International forces applied pressure again. Trump had already been losing patience with Netanyahu. But the Israelis insisted on their campaign against Hezbollah. The Iranians even went as far as to apply pressure. But there was little they could do after having put their vassals and the Lebanese population in this disastrous situation. An agreement with the Lebanese government was made without the presence of Hezbollah, which, in turn, rejected any talks. Even so, the damage was already done. The Israelis had taken control of a large stretch of territory in southern Lebanon, destroyed several villages, and all Hezbollah managed to do was destroy tanks and kill a few soldiers. Meanwhile, Lebanon witnessed tragedy with more than 4,000 civilians killed, all in a fight for the Iranian regime, which now, at least until around 1,000. In June 2026, he emerged victorious and calm with a possible billion-dollar deal with the United States. They were schizophrenic peace agreements, which included not-so-peaceful missiles crossing the skies. However, until that month, there was no terror from bombers inside the cities of Iran. These agreements were still an advantage for Iran, but there was a serious problem. Such talks included Hezbollah, but not the Lebanese people. Not that Israel, Hezbollah, or Iran seemed to care about that.